in it was to declare this person was no ordinary mortal. In Palenque, very few were buried with Cinnabar. Pakal the Great, the mighty king whose pyramid dominates the site, was one. His body, like hers, was also saturated in the red powder. That detail alone drew speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife? His mother? Or someone of equal divine status? Her skull had been placed on a layer of jaguar skin, another sacred symbol. Around her, bone needles, obsidian blades, and miniature jade figurines hinted at rituals performed either during her life or in her honor at death. Every part of her burial told a story without words, a story of power cloaked in secrecy, a woman prepared to cross into the underworld, not in silence, but in ceremony, drenched in the color of sacrifice. Surrounding the Red Queen's crimson-drenched remains was a world of silence, broken only by the gleam of jade, shell, and obsidian. These were not mere ornaments. They were offerings, each one carefully chosen to accompany her on the journey to the Maya afterlife, the Xibalba. At her sides were jade necklaces, heavy and cold, their polished surfaces still radiant after 300 years underground. Jade was not just beautiful, it was sacred. The Maya considered it a symbol of eternal life. It represented the green of maize, the vitality of the jungle, and the breath of the gods. Only the elite were buried with jade. For the Red Queen, it covered her chest, wrists, and ears, a clear sign that in life she wielded influence, perhaps even divine favor. One of the most haunting objects was the jade funerary mask, placed delicately over her face. Unlike the golden death masks of Egypt, this one was subtle, constructed from dozens of tiny mosaic tiles, arranged to mimic the contours of her skull. The mask served a ritual function, to protect the soul, to preserve identity, and to present her as divine in the eyes of the gods. Scattered near her bones were bone needles, obsidian blades, and shell artifacts. These could have been tools of ritual or symbols of her status, as priestess, healer, or royal matriarch. One bone pin was engraved, faint but purposeful, a small echo of her voice lost to time. At her feet and along the edges of the tomb were ceramic vessels, still sealed, likely once filled with offerings, food, drink, or incense to sustain her spirit beyond death. The Maya believed the afterlife was a journey, dangerous, layered, filled with challenges. These items weren't luxuries, they were necessities. To modernize, the tomb feels intimate, not overloaded, but intentional. There was no gold, no chariots, no pomp, just items chosen with spiritual weight. It was a map for the soul. Through these treasures, we glimpse how the Maya understood death, not as finality, but as a transition of power. The Red Queen wasn't buried to be forgotten. She was being prepared to ascend. For all the grandeur of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind one haunting void. No name. No inscriptions adorned her sarcophagus. No glyphs on the walls identified her. She was clearly someone powerful. But who? From the moment her tomb was opened, scholars began trying to connect the dots. The most compelling theory? That the Red Queen was Tsakbu Ajau, the wife of Kinich Janab Pakal, known today as Pakal the Great, the most famous ruler of Palenque. Tsakbu Ajau was more than just Pakal's consort. She was born into nobility and married into Palenque's royal dynasty at a young age. She bore at least 3 sons, all of whom held high status, and she played a key ceremonial role during her husband's reign. If anyone could be buried with such honor, it was her. Supporting this theory was the tomb's location, just a few feet away from Pakal's own grand burial in Temple of the Inscriptions. The proximity suggests a deliberate pairing, husband and wife, rulers even in death. And then there's the cinnabar. Only 2 burials in Palenque were found with such intense cinnabar coverage, Pakal and the Red Queen. It's unlikely this was coincidence. But here's where the mystery deepens. DNA tests were conducted on both sets of remains in hopes of confirming the connection. But the results? inconclusive. The woman's bones showed no direct maternal link to Pakal, but that didn't rule out a spousal relationship. After all, marriage does not require shared blood. Some have argued she could have been Sak-Kuk, Pakal's powerful mother, who ruled Palanque before he came of age. Others suggest she may have been a high priestess, or a sister, or a royal ancestor whose name has simply been lost to history's erosion. Still, the evidence points most strongly to Tsakbu Ajau, a queen by title, a mother of kings, and a spiritual counterpart to Pakal. The lack of a name may not be an oversight. It may have been intentional. In Maya cosmology, the soul lived on not through monuments, but through ritual, symbol, and the whispers of the earth. And so the Red Queen remained suspended between legend and truth, a woman who ruled, remembered not in stone, but in scarlet and silence. To understand the Red Queen, we must understand the world she came from, a world where Maya women, especially royal ones, held more influence than many realize. In Maya civilization, politics was often a family affair. Royal women weren't merely passive consorts. They were diplomats, priestesses, and power brokers. They conducted rituals, sponsored temples, and played crucial roles in maintaining dynastic legitimacy. Their bloodlines were political capital, used to forge alliances and secure claims to the throne. Take Sak-Kuk, for example, the mother of Pakal the Great. When the throne of Palanque was left vacant, she took power herself and ruled as queen regent until her son came of age. She wasn't a placeholder. She was a ruler in her own right, issuing decrees and overseeing construction projects. Without her, Pakal may never have risen at all. And she wasn't an anomaly. Across the Maya world, in places like Yaxchilan, Naranjo, and Calakmul, inscriptions show women performing major ceremonies, engaging in warfare diplomacy, and sometimes ruling outright. They were often portrayed in stelae and murals, dressed in elaborate headdresses and regalia, standing beside kings as equals, or sometimes above them. Their words were carved in glyphs. Their names were remembered, until they weren't. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, much of that memory had eroded. The colonial lens saw native women as silent figures in a male-dominated world, but the archaeology tells a different story, one of complex gender roles, where power was negotiated, not simply inherited. This context casts the Red Queen in a new light. She may not have ruled in name, but her burial, rich, sacred, and positioned beside Pakal, suggests she was a central pillar in the royal order. Her jade mask wasn't just decoration. It was a symbol of identity, of power held in life and protected in death. Her bloodline may have been the very glue that held Palanca's dynasty together. In Maya civilization, a queen wasn't just a queen. She was a keeper of sacred lineage, a voice in ceremony, and often the bridge between gods and men. The Red Queen may be nameless, but in her world, she was never voiceless. The Red Queen wasn't just buried with treasures. She was buried in architecture rich with purpose, layered with Maya cosmology, ritual symbolism, and intentional design. Her tomb wasn't merely a grave, it was a gateway to eternity. Her body was discovered inside Temple Third, one of the smaller pyramids within the heart of Palanque, yet its proximity to Temple of the Inscriptions, the resting place of Pakal the Great, is telling. These temples weren't built randomly. Their positioning was sacred, guided by astrology, myth, and dynastic legacy. Temple the Third rises modestly compared to its grand neighbour, but it hides something even more intimate. A sealed crypt, untouched by looters, perfectly preserved. It was constructed deep within the temple's core, accessible only by a steep, narrow staircase. The descent into her tomb feels almost symbolic, a ritual journey downward, into the underworld. The chamber itself is stark, made of cut stone, sealed tightly for over 1300 years. No glyphs or murals cover the walls. No ornate carvings tell her story. but perhaps that silence is intentional. This was a space not for the living to interpret, but for the dead to transform. At the centre, her sarcophagus sits like an altar. Crafted from limestone, it echoes the grand stone coffin of Pakal next door. While Pakal's lid is famously engraved with scenes of cosmic rebirth, the Red Queen's tomb is more subdued. The focus is inward, on the body, on the cinnabar, on the ritual of death itself, and yet there are subtle architectural cues that hint at meaning. The tomb is aligned east to west, a symbolic path mirroring the sun's journey from life to death. The chamber is small, but powerful. It feels deliberate, personal, a sacred enclosure for someone revered. Maya temples were cosmological tools, bridges between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. To be buried in one was to be elevated beyond the human realm. The Red Queen's eternal home wasn't an afterthought. It was a carefully constructed shrine, a place where death became transformation. Her bones rest in stone, her essence in cinnabar, and her legacy in the architecture itself. A temple that speaks without words, telling us she mattered. To the ancient Maya, death wasn't the end. It was a threshold, a sacred passage into the underworld, known as Xibalba. And for someone like the Red Queen, this crossing was not only spiritual, it was political, cosmological, and deeply ritualized. Burial rituals were carefully choreographed events, rooted in myth and meant to guide the soul through the treacherous layers of the underworld. Maya texts and iconography tell us that Xibalba was no peaceful afterlife. It was a maze of darkness, rivers of blood, trials, and gods of death. Only those properly buried, ritually prepared, and spiritually equipped could make the journey successfully. The Red Queen was buried wrapped in cinnabar, encased in stone, and surrounded by offerings, all signs of an elite burial. But there's more. The presence of bone needles and obsidian blades in her tomb hint at auto-sacrifice rituals, possibly symbolic tools representing rites she had performed in life, or that were reenacted at her burial to empower her spirit. Her funerary mask, carefully assembled from jade tiles, was not simply decorative. It may have served as a spiritual vessel, preserving her face and identity as she journeyed into the afterlife. In Maya belief, the face was a mirror of the soul, and the soul needed to be recognized by the gods. The ceramic vessels surrounding her may have once held chocolate, maize, water, or even pulque, to nourish her in the next world. Other items, like stingray spines or shell trumpets, could have represented spiritual tools, calls to the gods, or tokens of ritual communication. Burial wasn't just a goodbye. It was a transformation. The Maya believed in cycles, death as seed, burial as planting, and the afterlife as rebirth. Kings and queens were often seen as earthly incarnations of gods, and in death they returned to those divine origins. The Red Queen, covered in the colour of blood, entombed in a pyramid and honoured with offerings, was being prepared for rebirth, not as a mortal, but as a being tied to the sacred order of the cosmos. Her burial wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning of her legend. Just a few steps away from the Red Queen's final resting place lies one of the most iconic tombs in Mesoamerica, that of Kinich Janab Pakal, known simply as Pakal the Great. His burial inside the Grand Temple of the Inscriptions is celebrated for its artistry, scale, and deeply spiritual symbolism. But what makes the Red Queen's tomb so extraordinary is not only what was inside, it's where it was found. Her sarcophagus was hidden within Temple Threed, directly adjacent to Pakal's monument. In a city like Palanque, where every temple was carefully positioned to reflect cosmic principles, this closeness was no coincidence. It was intentional, a statement etched in stone. Many scholars believe the Red Queen was Tzakbu Ajao, Pakal's queen and trusted consort. While her tomb lacks inscriptions, the similarities between their burials are striking. Both wrapped in cinnabar, both entombed in pyramids, both buried with jade and both treated with extreme reverence. These rituals mirror each other, as if two halves of a sacred narrative. Pakal's lid famously depicts him falling into the underworld tree, a cosmic scene of death and rebirth. The Red Queen's simpler tomb contains no such iconography, but the symbolism lies in the pairing itself. If Pakal represented the sun, journeying through the underworld at night to rise again, then the Red Queen may have represented the moon, the feminine force that follows its own mysterious path in the sky. Together, they embodied a cosmic duality, masculine and feminine, king and queen, sun and moon, order and ritual. In Maya mythology, rulership was not singular, it was relational. Harmony in the cosmos required balance, and that balance extended into the dynastic court. By placing the Red Queen beside Pakal, the Maya were preserving not just a marriage, but a cosmic partnership. Their proximity in death may have mirrored their roles in life, a queen not behind, but beside her king, sharing not just a throne, but a legacy. In their tombs, they speak without words. Two souls, wrapped in cinnabar and stone, joined across eternity, one of history's most sacred silences. Though her name was lost to time, the Red Queen of Palenque endures, not as a forgotten relic, but as one of the most enigmatic and powerful women of the ancient world. Her tomb, sealed for over 1,300 years, now whispers across centuries, inviting questions that echo louder with every discovery. She represents a mystery that still resists full understanding. We may never know exactly who she was. No glyph carved her name. No stela told her story. And yet, the care in her burial, the richness of her offerings, the symbolism of her crimson-drenched bones, all speak of a woman profoundly important. Not merely as a wife or consort, but as someone who held real influence, spiritual weight, and royal blood. Today, the Red Queen forces us to re-evaluate assumptions. She's a reminder that in the ancient Maya world, women were not silent. They led rituals, governed cities, and shaped dynasties. While kings like Pakal have long taken the spotlight, the Red Queen's re-emergence reminds us that power did not belong to men alone. It flowed through mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries. Her legacy is more than the treasures she left behind. It's the conversation she started among archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers. Every jade bead, every layer of cinnabar, every architectural choice in Temple Tethide tells us something deliberate. This woman mattered, and perhaps that's the most extraordinary part of her story. Not what we know, but what we still don't. The Red Queen teaches us that history isn't just a collection of facts, it's a living puzzle, a shared human longing to connect with the past. In that sense, her legacy is still unfolding. She lies wrapped in red, the colour of life and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth. Her face, once hidden behind a jade mask, now stares back at us through science, art, and wonder. She remains nameless, but not voiceless. Mysterious, but not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death, she rules something greater, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone. Her story was written in silence. And still, somehow, she speaks. Frida Kahlo was born on July 6, 1907, in the vibrant district of Coyoacán, then a village on the outskirts of Mexico City. Her childhood home, the Casa Azul, the Blue House, was filled with colour, contradiction, and quiet strength. It would later become a sanctuary, a battleground, and a museum to one of the most iconic artists of the 20th century. Frida was the third of 4 daughters born to Guillermo Kahlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilde Calderón, a devout Catholic of indigenous and Spanish descent. Her parents were opposites: Guillermo, reserved and intellectual; Matilde, religious and emotionally distant. Frida would inherit her father's introspection and artistic eye, but also her mother's fierce resilience. As a child, Frida was imaginative, outspoken, and bold. She read voraciously and asked questions most adults didn't want to answer. But at the age of 6, she contracted polio, which left her right leg thinner and weaker than the other. A physical difference she tried to mask with long skirts, but never allowed to limit her spirit. The illness left her bedridden for months and isolated from other children. During this time, she grew close to her father, who encouraged her to exercise, ride bicycles, and stay mentally sharp. Unlike most girls of her time, Frida didn't aspire to become a wife or a homemaker. Her goal? To become a doctor. She enrolled in the prestigious National Preparatory School in Mexico City at age 15, one of only a handful of girls accepted. There, she stood out not just for her intelligence, but for her rebellious wit, radical thinking, and unique sense of style. She joined a group of young intellectuals known as the Cachuchas, who debated philosophy, literature, and politics. Frida was drawn to revolution, to ideas that challenged tradition. But even in those early years, before the bus crash that would define her body, and before the fame that would define her legacy, Frida Kahlo was already painting herself into the world, with sharp edges, unapologetic ideas, and an identity too big to fit inside anyone else's expectations. She wasn't just growing up in Coyoacán, she was preparing to remake herself entirely. On September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo's life was split in two, the girl she had been and the woman she was forced to become. That afternoon, she boarded a wooden bus with her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arias, after school. They were laughing, teasing each other, and probably arguing. Frida never did anything halfway. But moments later, the bus collided with a streetcar, and in an instant, her future unraveled into pain, metal, and silence. The crash was horrific. The streetcar crushed the bus against a wall, splintering wood and flinging passengers. Frida was impaled by an iron handrail. It entered her left hip and exited through her pelvis. Her spinal column fractured in 3 places. Her right leg shattered, her foot dislocated. Her collarbone and ribs broke. Her shoulder was dislocated. Her abdomen was pierced. She was just 18 years old. A man covered her with a borrowed overcoat. Someone else noticed her body was sparkling, not from blood, but from the gold powder she had been carrying in a pouch. It had exploded on impact, dusting her broken form in what looked like glittering ash. Frida was taken to the Red Cross hospital and underwent numerous surgeries over the following months. She spent weeks in a body cast, flat on her back, immobile, writhing with infection and uncertainty. The future she'd imagined, of becoming a doctor, slipped further away with every passing day. But in that stillness, something began to stir. Her father gave her brushes. Her mother rigged a special easel to hang above her bed. A mirror was placed on the canopy so she could see herself. And there, lying in plaster and agony, Frida began to paint, first out of boredom, then out of obsession. Her first subjects were her own reflection, because she was all she had. But what emerged wasn't vanity. It was survival. The crash had broken her physically, but it had also opened a door into her own mind, her own body, and eventually into the surreal language of pain and identity that would define her art. The girl who wanted to heal others now began healing herself, one brush stroke at a time. As Frida Kahlo lay encased in plaster and steel, a body fighting itself with every breath, she began to paint. What started as a form of therapy soon became a language, and that language was deeply personal, brutally honest, and often hard to look at. Which was precisely the point. Frida didn't paint pretty flowers or polite landscapes. She painted pain. Her pain. Physical, emotional, and existential. Her first subjects were self-portraits, not because she was vain, but because, as she famously said, "I paint myself because I am so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." Her early works were small in scale, painted on tin or wood panels, inspired by Mexican retablos. Devotional paintings meant to tell stories of suffering and miracles. Frida turned this tradition inward. Her body became the canvas. Her emotions became the altar. She painted herself as split, as pierced, as bleeding. In one painting, she is impaled by nails, like a modern-day martyr. In another, she floats in a barren landscape, tethered to a broken column, a metaphor for her shattered spine. She painted herself weeping, fractured, decapitated, and bare, but never passive, always watching. Her pain was not sanitized. She painted the ugliness of trauma with beauty, defiance, and even humor. Each piece was a reclamation of her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman in a world that often tried to define her. But Frida wasn't just telling her story. She was inventing a new kind of visual narrative, one that blended Mexican folk art, surrealism, medical illustration, and symbolism. Her paintings became dreamlike autopsies of her soul, framed in color, culture, and myth. By the time she recovered enough to walk again, albeit painfully, Frida was no longer the girl who had wanted to be a doctor. She was an artist, and her art was unlike anything anyone had seen. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into a source of creation. Frida Kahlo didn't just paint her pain. She made the world look at it, and in doing so, she turned suffering into a sacred act of self-expression. In 1928, still recovering, still painting, and just 21 years old, Frida Kahlo met the man who would become the most profound and turbulent relationship of her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years her senior, already Mexico's most famous painter. Massive in both stature and presence, Rivera was a giant of Mexican muralism, known for his sweeping, politically charged frescoes that told the story of the Mexican people. Frida had seen his work before. She admired it. But now she wanted his opinion of her work. She brought her paintings to him at the Ministry of Education, interrupting his scaffolded work to ask bluntly, "Do I have talent?" Diego took one look and said yes, and not just out of kindness. He recognized in her something rare, an unfiltered voice, raw and unpretentious, full of rage, irony, pain, and beauty. They began a relationship that was as consuming as it was creative. Frida once said, "I suffered 2 accidents in my life. One in which a streetcar knocked me down. The other was Diego." They married in 1929, an odd pairing to outsiders. Diego, massive, unfaithful, politically famous. Frida, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, already walking with a cane. Her parents called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their bond was passionate, but chaotic. Diego supported her art and encouraged her growth as a painter, but he was also endlessly unfaithful, even with Frida's own sister, Cristina. Frida was devastated, and in return, she took lovers of her own, both men and women, including rumored affairs with Leon Trotsky and painter Georgia O'Keeffe. They divorced in 1939, then remarried a year later with different terms. This time, Frida would keep her autonomy, her home, her money, her name. Their second marriage was less about traditional love and more about creative partnership and mutual understanding. Despite the betrayals and the heartbreak, Diego remained a constant force in Frida's life. He challenged her, he wounded her, but he also believed in her, as an artist, as a revolutionary, and as a woman who could redefine what painting could be. Together, they were not peaceful, but they were legendary. In the 1930s, Frida Kahlo followed Diego Rivera on a journey north to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York, as he completed high-profile mural commissions. These years abroad brought her face-to-face with American industrialism, wealth, and the contradictions of capitalism, and they left her with deep political discomfort. Frida was a proud Mexican nationalist, a committed communist, and an admirer of indigenous traditions. The opulence she witnessed in the United States, especially while the Great Depression ravaged much of the country, only deepened her sense of disillusionment. In letters home, she mocked the culture's materialism and obsession with appearances. She missed the grit, color, and contradiction of Mexico. While Diego painted enormous murals on factory walls, Frida began to paint smaller, quieter revolutions, deeply personal works on tin and canvas. Her style solidified, sharp, surreal, emotional, and intimate. It was during this time that she produced some of her most iconic self-portraits. Frida didn't just paint herself for vanity. She painted herself to survive. Her identity became her landscape. With her body constantly in pain from her accident, multiple surgeries, and a failed pregnancy in Detroit, she turned inward. Her portraits showed her bleeding, fragmented, exposed. Yet her face was always calm, always direct, unapologetic. One of her most powerful works, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her lying on a hospital bed, crying, surrounded by floating symbols of loss. A fetus, a snail, medical equipment, a cracked pelvis. It was raw, graphic, and deeply emotional, a canvas that bled with truth. Back in Mexico, Frida immersed herself in leftist politics. She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home while he lived in exile. Frida wore Tehuana dresses, traditional indigenous garments, not just as fashion, but as a political and cultural statement. Her art was never disconnected from her beliefs. Her identity, her body, and her ideology all intertwined in her work. While Rivera was painting murals of revolution, Frida painted its human cost, the body in pieces, the mind on fire, and the self always staring back. In exile and in illness, she became not just a painter of pain, but a painter of resistance. When Frida Kahlo returned to Mexico in the late 1930s, she was no longer just Diego Rivera's wife. She had become something else entirely. A force, an artist whose work radiated with raw honesty, surreal symbolism, and cultural identity. Back in her homeland, she stepped fully into herself. Her Casa Azul in Coyoacán became a sanctuary of color and contradiction. Bright cobalt walls, yellow trim, Aztec statues in the garden, monkeys and parrots wandering freely. The house was a living extension of Frida's imagination. It was a blend of tradition and rebellion, elegance and earth. Here, she surrounded herself with pre-Columbian artifacts, ex-votos, folk art, and revolutionary books. She wore bold Tehuana dresses, wove flowers into her hair, and painted amid the scent of copal incense and the sounds of mariachi on the street outside. This period marked an explosion of creativity. Her paintings became more intricate, more symbolic, and more political. Works like The Two Fridas revealed a divided self, one in European dress with a bleeding heart, the other in indigenous clothing, strong and composed. It was Frida's visual autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and heritage. In 1939, she exhibited her work in Paris, where artists like Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her fiercely original style. But even among the surrealists, Frida stood apart. When André Breton tried to label her as one of their own, she pushed back. "They thought I was a surrealist," she said. "But I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality." She painted Mexico, not the romantic postcard version, but the living, breathing country she adored. Her work pulsed with symbolism, skeletons, hummingbirds, hearts, thorns, corn, and blood. She honored the indigenous roots of her homeland while unmasking the violence of its past and present. But even as her artistic voice grew stronger, her health continued to decline. Multiple surgeries, infections, and chronic pain became daily realities. Still, she painted through it, propped up in bed, torso bound in corsets, fingers clenched around the brush. Frida had returned to Mexico not to rest, but to reclaim her power, through paint, through politics, and through her fearless embrace of the self. As the 1940s wore on, Frida Kahlo's body continued to betray her. Her spine was deteriorating. Her right leg was constantly infected. She underwent more than 30 surgeries in her lifetime, often in grueling succession. At times, she was bedridden for months, encased in body casts or immobilized by traction devices that stretched her bones apart. But still, she painted. Each canvas during these years became both a release and an act of resistance. Her works grew darker, more defiant. She painted with a clarity sharpened by pain, refusing to hide behind metaphor. In The Broken Column, she presents herself split down the middle, her body pierced with nails, a cracked ionic column replacing her spine. Yet her face is stoic, her gaze unflinching. Pain for Frida was no longer just a subject. It was her companion, her antagonist, her muse. Her political voice also grew louder. She joined the Mexican Communist Party, marched in demonstrations, wrote fiery letters, and called out imperialism and injustice. When her health no longer allowed her to walk, she appeared at protests in a wheelchair, defiantly holding signs and shouting slogans. In 1953, Frida was given her first solo exhibition in Mexico, a long overdue celebration of her art. But her health was so fragile, doctors told her she couldn't attend. So she did what only Frida would do. She arrived by ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, and placed in the center of the gallery on her hospital bed. Dressed in traditional finery, surrounded by her own work, she greeted guests with tequila, laughter, and that fire still burning in her eyes. Her final paintings were both childlike and harrowing. In Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick, she painted herself wearing a steel corset, cradled by the hands of Marx, casting away symbols of oppression. Her last known work was a still life of sliced watermelons, one piece bearing the words, "Viva la vida," long live life. Even in the face of death, she remained defiant, joyful, and political. Frida Kahlo's last portraits weren't just self-portraits. They were acts of revolution, painted in pain, but always signed with life. On July 13, 1954, at the age of 47, Frida Kahlo died in the same place she had been born, La Casa Azul in Coyoacán. The official cause was listed as a pulmonary embolism, but those closest to her whispered of something deeper. She had been ill, yes, but also exhausted. By pain, by surgeries, by the long war with her own body. Just days before, she had attended a political protest against the CIA-led coup in Guatemala. Weak and wheelchair-bound, she insisted on going, her clenched fist raised in the air. Revolution remained her final heartbeat. Her last diary entry was brief but piercing. "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return." Frida's funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most prestigious cultural institution. Her body, draped in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, was watched over by friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera was inconsolable. He called her the greatest love of his life, even as his betrayals had nearly broken her. But in the years that followed her death, something extraordinary happened. Frida Kahlo refused to disappear. At first, her name was whispered only in art circles. Her works weren't easy to categorize, too political for surrealists, too surreal for traditionalists. But slowly, her image, her story, and her defiance began to resonate. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as feminist scholars and activists reclaimed forgotten voices, Frida's became louder. She wasn't just a painter anymore. She was a symbol of pain turned into beauty, of feminism born through resistance, of Mexican identity celebrated without apology, of queerness, disability, revolution, and authenticity. Her face, unibrow, gaze, flowers in her hair, became iconic. Her home became a museum. Her diary became a sacred text. And her paintings now hang in the world's greatest museums. Frida Kahlo had lived much of her life in Diego's shadow. But in death, she stepped forward. She didn't just leave behind paintings. She left behind a mirror and dared us all to look, not with pity, not with fear, but with fire. Today, Frida Kahlo's face is everywhere, printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, turned into dolls, memes, posters, and icons. Her signature unibrow, her flower-crowned hair, her direct gaze, all instantly recognizable. But what makes her legacy powerful isn't just that people know her face, it's that they recognize the truth behind it. Frida didn't try to be flawless. She didn't fit into boxes. She wasn't conventional, and she didn't care to be. In a world that demands perfection, she gave us realness. Raw, messy, vibrant, angry, joyful, contradictory realness. She celebrated what made her different: her disability, her queerness, her politics, her culture, and turned it into art that transcended borders and decades. She's become more than an artist. She's a global symbol of defiance, feminism, cultural pride, and creative resistance. For queer communities, she's a fearless bisexual icon who lived openly and unapologetically in a time that demanded silence. For women, she's a reminder that power doesn't require permission. For disabled artists, she's proof that pain can fuel the brush, not stop it. And for Mexico, she's a daughter reclaimed, fierce, folkloric, and forever part of the national soul. Her paintings, once dismissed as too strange or too personal, are now among the most revered in the world. Works like The Two Fridas, Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird, and The Broken Column aren't just seen, they're felt deeply by anyone who has ever suffered and needed to turn that suffering into something sacred. She lived in the margins and turned them into center stage. She embraced contradiction. A communist who wore gold, a woman betrayed who loved again, a body in pieces with a soul unbreakable. And through it all, she painted, not just with colour, but with conviction. Frida Kahlo never asked to be a symbol. She simply told the truth about herself. And in doing so, told the truth for millions of others who had never seen themselves reflected in art before. Now, when we see her face, we see courage, we see colour, we see resistance, we see Frida, not gone, but immortal.